This is a situation currently unfolding in my life. It has been persisting for nearly 3 weeks now. I recently decided to create a profile on the dating website Plenty of Fish. I had been single for 8 months and knew several friends who had found success on the platform. I figured there was no harm in trying it out for myself. About a month after I signed up, I received a message from a very attractive girl. We seemed to get along quite well and maintained a conversation for a few weeks. We eventually decided to exchange our Kik usernames. That was the moment everything took a turn for the worse. Within the span of only 4 messages, she admitted that her profile pictures were fake. She proceeded to send me new ones, promising me that she was being honest this time, and swearing that she was real. However, the girl in the new photos looked too good to be true, being a frequent viewer of the show Catfish. I decided to perform a reverse image search. My suspicions were confirmed when I found the identity of the real girl in the photos. When I confronted her with my findings, she sent another set of images. Once again, a quick search proved they were not her. At this point, I became completely fed up with the deception. I told her firmly to never contact me again. My rejection caused her to become extremely angry. She began hurling every possible insult at me, claiming that she was a stripper. She claimed she could have provided me with any pleasure I desired, and insisted that I was the one missing out. Shortly after, I started receiving messages from various new accounts. These accounts on Plenty of Fish and Kik all claimed to be her friends or colleagues. However, they all utilized the exact same typing style she did. Deep down, I knew with certainty that they were all just her using different aliases. I finally decided I had dealt with enough of her behavior. I signed out of Kik on my mobile device, deleted the application entirely, and attempted to move on with my day. However, my phone soon began buzzing with standard text messages. She had somehow obtained my personal number. She started sending a barrage of messages, claiming she was sorry, professing her love for me, and stating she desperately wanted me back. Eventually, a final message appeared that contained nothing but a web link. I examined the URL and noticed it ended with the phrase, "I love you." I chose not to open it. Feeling physically sick to my stomach from the stress, I tried to have dinner, but I could not bring myself to actually cook anything. Instead, I simply sat at my desk in the dark with a burger and a Coke. I switched on my laptop, hoping to find a good show to watch as a distraction. However, I felt so mentally drained that I ended up mindlessly scrolling through reels on YouTube. Suddenly, without any input from me, a new browser tab jerked open. The same link from the text message, the one ending in "I love you," loaded itself onto my screen. The entire window theme instantly shifted into a deep, unnatural shape. My heart skipped a beat as a pop-up window appeared. It was a live feed of my own face, captured from my webcam. Another pop-up window appeared right next to it. In that frame, I could see the dim silhouette of a woman sitting in a pitch-black room, silently watching me through the screen. I panicked and immediately tried to shut the laptop down, but the entire system had been locked. Even the physical power button on the hardware would not respond to my touch. I looked at the icons on my desktop with horror. Every one of my files, including my office work, my personal photos, and my private documents, was now hidden behind an encryption shield. A message flashed across the center of my screen. It informed me that my system was locked. It stated that to regain access to my work and personal files, I was required to share my bank details with the lady in the shadow. It further noted that a fee of $500 would be charged. It was in that moment that I realized this was not a simple case of catfishing. It was a targeted scam, originating from the dark web. I did not stick around to see what the silhouette would do next. I reached behind my desk and ripped the power cord for the Wi-Fi router out of the wall. Then, I flipped the laptop over and tore the battery straight out of the casing. The screen finally went dead. Thankfully, I had been cautious enough to keep a backup of almost all my important data on a separate portable hard drive. This device was not plugged into the computer at the time. I took the laptop to a professional service center the following morning. The technicians informed me that the entire operating system had been compromised and that they would have to reinstall Windows from scratch. They also issued a stern warning for me to change my network immediately. as my personal information was likely now floating around on a dark web hit list. I ended up losing my personal settings and quite a few nights of sleep, but I am proud to say I did not give that shadow a single cent of my money.
A few months ago, I decided that I was finally ready to move on from the breakup I had experienced during the previous summer. My relationship with my long-term girlfriend had ended, and it had taken me a significant amount of time to process the heartbreak. However, there eventually comes a point where a person simply has to get back out there and try again. I made the decision to download the dating app Hinge and began the process of looking through various profiles. In my experience, it felt like the most effective app available because it allowed for direct messaging. This feature meant I didn't have to sit around hoping for a mutual match before starting a conversation. It gave me a much better opportunity to talk to the specific kind of women I found attractive. One of those women was a Persian girl named Sarosh. Saroshi was truly one of the most beautiful people I had ever seen. She had a striking mane of dark, wild hair that was dyed blonde at the tips. Her features were very defined, with high cheekbones and perfectly shaped eyebrows. Her eyes were perhaps her most captivating feature, being a deep, dark brown that seemed very alluring. She was absolutely stunning. I felt like I had a bit of a competitive advantage because she had grown up in Tehran, the capital of Iran, and I happened to speak a small amount of Farsi. I thought that mentioning my knowledge of her native language might impress her, and it turned out that I was right. Within about an hour of sending my opening message, we were having a great conversation. She seemed to be an incredibly busy individual, so I felt quite flattered when she told me she would clear some time in her schedule to meet me. We eventually made arrangements to get coffee over the upcoming weekend. When the day of the date arrived, she showed up wearing her gym clothes. She was very quick to apologize for her casual appearance, explaining that she had just finished a session with her personal trainer and didn't have time to change. Her outfit didn't bother me in the least. She looked incredible in her yoga pants. We sat down with our coffees and began the typical first date ritual of discussing our lives, our jobs, and our various interests. While we were talking, I happened to look out of the large glass windows of the cafe. I noticed a man leaning against a car outside. At first, I assumed my mind was just playing tricks on me or that I was being paranoid, but after watching him for a minute or two, I realized he was staring directly at us without blinking. Saroshi eventually noticed that my attention was drifting over her shoulder. She asked me what I was looking at, and I mentioned the man outside who seemed to be staring us down quite intensely. She turned around to see for herself, but she spun back toward me almost instantly. The look on her face was one of pure terror. She urgently told me that we needed to leave the shop right that second. I asked her why and if she knew the man, but she denied knowing who he was. Despite her denial, I wasn't naive. I understood the situation immediately. It was obvious that this was either a very controlling family member or a dangerous ex-boyfriend. I initially assumed that the man would just follow us for a bit to try and act intimidating, but I never could have imagined that he would actually get physical with me. The way he eventually attacked me was terrifying. The city where I live is built up along a very wide river, and the coffee shop we had chosen was located right on the docks. As we started walking along the city's promenade, the man suddenly cornered me. He grabbed me tightly by the throat and began shoving me backward with a lot of force. Before I knew it, my back was pressed against the railings of the walkway, and I was leaning out over the water. I tried my best to pry his hands off of me, but the man was incredibly large and strong. No matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't break his grip. The river in my city is notorious for having an extremely powerful current. It is common knowledge that if someone falls into the water from a boat or the side of the promenade, they are in grave danger. The current is strong enough to pull a person under, drown them, and sweep them out into the Irish Sea in a very short amount of time. While he held me there, he began shouting threats at me. He told me in a very aggressive, macho way that I needed to leave Saroshi alone and stay away from her. During the struggle, Saroshi was hitting him on the head and screaming at him to let me go. All I could think about in that moment was that if I went over those railings and into the water, I was a dead man. I honestly don't think the man realized how dangerous the river was. Based on his voice, he didn't have the local accent, so he wasn't from our city. He probably thought he could just toss me into the water to embarrass me or scare me off, assuming I would be able to swim to safety. I knew for a fact that wouldn't have been the case. If he had pushed me, he would have ended up facing a manslaughter charge. Fortunately, he didn't follow through with throwing me over. After he had yelled and vented some of his anger, he finally let go of my throat. He backed away from us and started walking back in the direction he had originally come from. I can acknowledge that Soroshi was a gorgeous woman, and I can understand why a guy might feel bitter or jealous after a breakup. However, the level of aggression he showed was insane. If he had been just a little bit angrier, or if he had completely lost his temper, I wouldn't be around to tell this story. I would likely be floating somewhere in the middle of the Irish Sea, or perhaps washing up on a beach in County Cork as a corpse. It is a frightening thought to realize my life was nearly ended just because someone couldn't handle their jealousy.
It is a chilling realization to look back at an evening and see exactly where the warning signs were ignored. A few months ago, a date began with a nagging sense of familiarity that could not be placed. The assumption was that the encounter had happened on a random night out, and because it was a last-minute arrangement, the expectations were kept low. A clear boundary was set early on. There was no desire for a serious relationship, only a casual hangout. In hindsight, that was the first mistake in a series of events that quickly spiraled into a nightmare. The man seemed decent enough at first, but his demeanor shifted the moment they arrived at the restaurant. While he declined to order food, he immediately began making forward comments about her body and curves. Though she tried to laugh it off to ease the tension, his bluntness felt inappropriate and aggressive. As she ate, the conversation took a turn toward the nice guy trope. He lamented about how other women never gave men like him a chance, which sent immediate red flags through her mind. Sensing danger, she fabricated a story about needing to head home early to dog-sit for her parents. He appeared to believe the excuse, but his behavior only grew more predatory. He spent the meal staring at her chest and pressured her for suggestive photos. When she expressed her discomfort and told him she didn't engage in that behavior, he briefly stopped, only to produce a strange set of gifts from his bag. He presented a bouquet of roses and, inexplicably, a bag of prawns from Tesco. Her confusion turned to genuine fear when he explained the gift. He claimed to know she loved prawns and tempura. The problem was that she had never mentioned her food preferences to him. The urge to run was overwhelming, yet the social pressure not to be rude kept her in her seat for the remaining hour. As the clock ticked down, he began reciting intimate details of her life, with terrifying accuracy. He knew which school she had attended, her personality traits as a child, and her current professional situation. When she finally demanded to know how he possessed this information, he revealed a disturbing level of premeditation. His mother had been one of her former teachers, and he had interrogated her for details while scouring the internet for anything else he could find. A timely text from her mother provided a temporary lifeline. She used the notification as an excuse to end the date, claiming her parents had mixed up the schedule, and she needed to leave immediately. The man accepted this, but insisted on walking her home. She attempted to compromise by suggesting he only walk her halfway, as she wasn't comfortable revealing her address. It was then that he dropped another bombshell. He already knew which road she lived on, though he claimed not to know the specific house number. When she called out how creepy and weird his knowledge was, he lied and claimed she had told him herself. For her own safety, she tried to steer them toward a well-lit main road, but he grabbed her hand and forced her toward a dark shortcut. Despite her protests, he dragged her onto a deserted street. In the shadows, he suddenly forced himself on her, shoving his tongue down her throat. She managed to push him away, and the sight of a distant stranger walking a dog provided enough of a distraction for her to bolt back toward the main road. Even then, he refused to leave. He continued to follow her until she stopped and tried to bid him a final polite farewell, mentioning it was nice to meet him again. At that point, the truth of their familiarity came out. He admitted they had never actually met before. He had simply lied about a previous encounter to trick her into meeting him. As she tried to walk away, he grabbed her again, pulling her towards some bushes while claiming there was one more thing he needed to do. The physical struggle intensified as he tightened his grip, his fingers digging into the soft skin of her arm with a strength that made her breath hitch. She tried to twist away, but he used his body weight to pin her closer to the rustling leaves of the overgrown hedge, the rough branches catching in her hair. Every time she tried to speak, he leaned in further, his shadow completely engulfing her, as he ignored her repeated pleas to be left alone. The air felt heavy and cold as she realized he wasn't just being pushy. He was actively trying to overpower her in the dark, secluded space. She felt a wave of nausea hit as he whispered about how it would only take a moment, his eyes darting around to ensure they were still hidden from the streetlights. The situation turned violent as he squeezed her wrist hard enough to cause pain, pulling her back for another forced kiss. He explicitly suggested they use the bushes for privacy, and though she screamed no and fought back, he continued to drag her toward the brush, promising it would only take a second. It was only the appearance of more dog walkers that caused him to hesitate. He took one last opportunity to assault her by grabbing her breast before she finally broke free and ran. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she fled, terrified that he was right behind her. She took a long, circuitous route home to ensure she wasn't being followed. Once inside the safety of her house, she collapsed into tears. The horror reached its peak when a message arrived on her phone from a different account. It was him describing the evening as the best date ever and calling her the prettiest girl he'd ever kissed. He signed off by calling himself a gentleman and mentioning that he was currently standing on her road. She sank to the floor, paralyzed by the realization of her proximity to him. Looking closer at his profile, the memory finally clicked. Years earlier, this same man had plagued her old Facebook account with disturbing messages and creepy, edited photos, professing his love. The entire terrifying ordeal, from the first greeting to the final threat, had lasted only 90 minutes, but the impact would last much longer. In early 2019, as a 16-year-old living in the UK, I agreed to a semi-blind date with a 19-year-old named Cameron. We had been introduced through a mutual friend and had seen photos of one another beforehand. To all outward appearances, Cameron seemed like a perfectly ordinary person. He enjoyed video games and anime, and nothing in his background suggested anything unusual or alarming. After exchanging numbers and texting for a single evening, we decided to meet the following day at a local Starbucks. Although I typically prefer to wait longer before meeting someone in person, I felt a sense of security, knowing we shared a trusted friend. I arrived at the coffee shop slightly ahead of schedule. Following my usual habit of buying my own drink, to avoid any sense of obligation, I ordered a coffee and found a seat facing away from the entrance. I spent about 15 minutes relaxing with a book until a text arrived from Cameron announcing his arrival. I messaged him back to indicate which table I was sitting at. Almost immediately, I felt someone standing directly behind me. As I began to turn my head to acknowledge him, he suddenly pressed his lips against my neck and began to suck on my skin before I could even utter a greeting. The gesture was incredibly invasive. I have always been deeply uncomfortable with anyone touching my neck due to being extremely ticklish. Even professional massages or hair treatments feel like an ordeal to me. To make matters worse, he had a heavy, unpleasant scent that reminded me of old dust. Startled and overwhelmed, I instinctively elbowed him in the chest to force him away. When he finally let go, he stared at me with an unsettling expression and gave a flat, deadpan laugh. The situation felt increasingly eerie. When I demanded an explanation for his behavior, he simply brushed it off by claiming he thought the gesture was cute. Despite my rising alarm, I tried to convince myself that first impressions could be misleading and that I should still attempt to have a conversation. However, he spent the duration of our talk staring inappropriately at my chest. He made a crude, direct comment, expressing surprise at my physical appearance based on my ethnicity, and stated his intention to keep me around. At that point, my discomfort turned into genuine fear. The vibes he was giving off were so predatory that I didn't feel safe simply standing up and walking out the front door. I retreated to the ladies' bathroom and waited for another woman to enter. Once someone arrived, I explained my situation and asked if she could help me leave without being spotted, as I was terrified he might try to follow me home. The woman was incredibly kind and agreed to help, even lending me her hat and scarf to mask my appearance. Under the cover of the winter accessories and the crowded room, we walked out together. She successfully helped me slip out through the Starbucks back exit without him noticing my departure. Afterward, he reached out to our mutual friend to ask where I had gone, but I instructed my friend never to mention me to him again. While I sometimes feel guilty for not ending the date more formally, The fear I felt in that moment was overwhelming. It was a disturbing experience that I hope never to repeat. For reference, I am a 27-year-old female, and this story takes place 10 years ago when I was 17. I had just started university and was excited about having a fresh new start, since I'd always been a nerdy outcast in high school. I had never had a boyfriend before. I'd never even been on a date, so I was naive and optimistic about boys. My introverted and awkward personality hadn't magically changed since entering university, so it's safe to say that I didn't meet any interesting guys at school. One late night, I was in my room working on an assignment on my laptop when I received a request on MSN Messenger. The email address was a boy's name with some numbers. The name was clearly ethnic and likely someone of the same origin as mine. Intrigued, I accepted. For the sake of the story, we'll call the boy Ken. We got chatting, and I asked him how he had gotten my email address. He dodged the question. I let it go, not thinking too much into it. This was from a time when it was normal to accept anyone and everyone as a friend on Facebook, as well as other social media platforms. As Ken and I continued to talk, I learned that he lived in my city and, apparently, wasn't much older than me. As I guessed, our roots were, in fact, in the same country, the motherland. I asked him why he didn't have a picture of himself on his display picture, and this prompted him to suggest that we turn on our webcams because he wanted to see me too. I declined, but he insisted. Somehow, he convinced me, and we both switched on our webcams. I was pleasantly surprised and somewhat relieved to see that Ken was a good-looking young guy, chatting to me from the comfort of his bedroom, seemingly very normal. Our MSN chats carried on for a few weeks. They developed into texts, and we even had a few phone calls after I had agreed to give him my phone number. I started to develop a crush on Ken. He asked me to go out with him a few times, but I was always pretty busy with school, and our schedules weren't lining up. Finally, we found one afternoon when we were both free and decided to schedule a lunch date. Ken had a car and had offered to pick me up from my university after I was done for the day. I was a little too dressed up for my C++ programming class, but just right for the lunch date we had planned at the local vegetarian restaurant. Stupidly, I didn't tell any of my friends where I was going or with whom, because I was embarrassed about going on my very first date at almost age 18 with someone who had randomly added me on MSNA. I waited outside my building when a black car with heavily tinted windows pulled up beside me. The passenger side window rolled down, and sure enough, there was Ken sitting in the driver's seat. I was happy to see that he was just as cute in person as he was on webcam. However, what I wasn't expecting was the intense smell of weed floating out the car. Not relevant, but it is part of the first impression. Admittedly, I was a bit taken aback and was concerned that he might be driving high. He unlocked the doors and motioned for me to get in, so I did without dispute. As I sat down in the passenger seat, he started acting overly familiar in a way that made me uncomfortable. "So," I started, "do you know where the restaurant is? I can guide you if you want." He smirked at me, but didn't say anything, and just started driving. Okay, kind of weird. I thought maybe I was just nervous or awkward, both of which I could sympathize with, so I let it be. I was about to try my hand at a little small talk, which I'm no good at, when I noticed him heading towards the highway ramp. I started to worry because the restaurant was not far from my campus, and there was no reason for us to be getting the highway. You don't need to get the highway. The restaurant's actually really nearby. I can guide you. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear my own nervousness. Ken finally spoke for the first time since I'd gotten in the car, suggested changing plans and going somewhere more private instead. We can play Need for Speed, and I can make you lunch. I realized I was putting myself in a risky situation with someone I barely knew for the first time, and I hadn't told anyone where I was going. My mind was racing. I knew that this would be an utterly stupid thing to do, and despite the clear red flags waving in my face, I decided that I didn't want to ruin our first date by rejecting his offer to make me lunch and play Need for Speed together, which I told him I liked playing. Don't judge me. So, like an idiot, I reluctantly agreed to avoid being rude. We made it to his house. It was apparently his family's home, and was situated in a sort of shady neighborhood. We stepped inside, and of course, no one was home except us. It was sparsely furnished and looked unkept, which struck me as pretty odd for a family home. He informed me that his Xbox was in his bedroom. I hesitated in the doorway, but he sat at the foot of his bed in front of the TV and patted the empty space beside him for me to have a seat. There was literally nowhere else to sit in this room, so I cautiously sat down, keeping as much distance as I could between us. I started to relax as we played Need for Speed, and he made us peanut butter and jellies to munch on. I was about to laugh at myself for being overly paranoid when Ken did something bizarre. He got up onto the bed and sat uncomfortably close behind me, invading my personal space, an extremely awkward position, and tried to guide my hands on the controller. I started to ask him what he was doing, and as if this wasn't uncomfortable enough, his behavior suddenly crossed a clear personal boundary. That is when I really started to panic. I thought he was going to try and grope my chest, but instead he started squeezing, and he continued acting in a way that made me feel uneasy and unsafe. I was more than a little chubby back then. Freshman, and then some, so you can imagine what that might have been like. I dropped the controller in pure shock and quickly stood up, fixing my shirt. I was at a loss for words, and he did nothing but smirk at me until he reacted in a way that made the situation even more uncomfortable. I felt completely disgusted and violated. I'd had enough. I lied and told him that I had a group project to work on and needed to go. He asked where I lived so that he could drop me home. Thankfully, I had the common sense to not tell him and ask him to drop me back at school instead, where I would be supposedly meeting my classmates, and he obliged. After our very uncomfortable first date, I decided I didn't want to talk to Ken anymore. I didn't block him on MSN or my phone, our only two methods of communication, but I rarely responded to his messages, and I ignored all of his calls. Once he messaged me on MSN at around 11 p.m. asking me to come over and telling me that he would send a cab to bring me over to his place. Thoroughly annoyed, I responded, "What do you take me for? Why do you even think I would want to go to that?" He replied saying that it was nothing dirty and that he promised. It was just bizarre. I was disgusted and didn't even reply. He continued trying to get in touch with me for months and then suddenly vanished. I figured he'd finally gotten the point. Now, I wish this story ended here, but it doesn't. I last heard from Ken in late February. He had stopped trying to contact me shortly after Valentine's Day. In April, 2 nuclear family members and I went on a holiday to visit another relative called Annie, who was living in the Caribbean at the time. Annie, who I love dearly, was and still is a bit of an eccentric. She considers herself very spiritual and is an active member of a large, well-known spiritual organization. She is deeply connected with the motherland, more than the rest of us are, and goes back for frequent visits. While we stayed with her in the Caribbean, she told us about her most recent trip to the motherland, where she met a wealthy and well-connected local woman through the organization, who quickly became a very close friend. Connie, the con artist. During our visit, Anne introduced us to Connie virtually over Skype, because Connie lived in the motherland. We chatted to her a few times throughout our vacation by Skype, and got to know her a little bit. Little did we know back then that Connie, whom Annie had spontaneously met halfway across the world in the motherland, would soon wreak utter havoc on our lives. Now, that's a story that I'm just not ready to tell, and perhaps may never be, because of how many lives were affected, and the severity of the damage that had been inflicted. What you need to know is that Connie was an outright criminal and con artist who had been targeting our family from long before Annie had actually met her. Their meeting was no coincidence. Not only did she manage to steal over $100,000 from our family, but she took any peace of mind or sense of security we had with it. When we finally caught on and confronted her, she insisted that we were mistaken, but disappeared into thin air once we forced her out of our lives. You're probably wondering what on earth this has to do with the story about Ken. Well, get this. The situation with Connie lasted many months. The whole thing is kind of a blur to me now, but as we spoke to her online in April, I remember the whole ordeal lasting well into the fall. While she normally resided in the motherland, Annie had invited her to visit and stay with us, where we, my whole family and I, presently live. That's when things really took a turn for the worst. Some of the things I clearly remember, and are important to this story, were that 1. The whole time she was staying with us, she was trying to convince me to transfer schools to a very obscure school and program in the US. I don't even live in the US and was actually getting very pushy about it. And two, she had asked me very personal and inappropriate questions and made uncomfortable comments about my personal life and future. Disturbing, I know. During this time, I was so emotionally drained and stressed that I didn't really think of anything but the situation at hand. In fact, I had stopped socializing almost entirely and even started habitually skipping classes. I had lost contact with my high school friends, and my university friends were too new to really care, so my strange behavior and new destructive habits went unnoticed. Fast forward one day after Connie's final disappearance in the fall. I was home with my dad when my cell phone rang. I looked at the caller ID, and it was a number I didn't have saved, so it was showing the contact information as whatever name the phone was registered under. My heart dropped to my stomach. My phone displayed a name. The first name was a man's name, and the last name was the same last name as Connie's. I began to panic, and I ran into my bedroom to answer the call. I had no idea what to expect, and when I answered the phone, I was greeted with a familiar voice. It was Ken. I honestly thought I was going to puke when I suddenly came to a realization that he had been a part of this whole sick plot. Of course, I don't have hard evidence to prove that he was connected to Connie, but let me explain. The timing of his appearance and reappearance into my life, the last name, a fairly unique surname originating from the part of the motherland where Connie is from. And I had never known Ken's last name until then. And the fact that he contacted me out of the blue, I had no idea why or how. It was all just too bizarre to be a mere coincidence. Of course, I freaked out at Ken when he called me, and I told him that if he ever called me again, I would call the police. His response was just a weird, dry half laugh, and then he said, "Well, okay then," in the most creepy voice you can think of, and hung up. I knew in my gut that that was their last attempt to get back in touch and somehow slither their way back into mine and my family's lives. Thankfully, I never heard from Ken again after that day. A while after all of this ended, I was having a conversation with a family member who was also closely involved in all of this, about the whole ordeal. And she told me she'd sensed something extremely wrong with Connie. She was pushing to have me sent off to the US to that obscure school, and she had an unshakable feeling that Connie was involved in some sort of trafficking scene, and that if I left, she would never see me again. The horrifying pieces came together, and I was just too damn naive to have seen it before. The memories flooded back to me when I heard that. How Ken told me, nothing dirty, I promise, when he invited me over, and how Connie was telling me to remain a virgin. As I said, I had never told a soul about Ken, nor about the weird V-card conversation with Connie. I strongly and firmly believe that Ken had been a sort of player in Connie's game, and was just there to keep me away from guys, and prevent me from having a boyfriend. For those of you wondering why we never called the police on Connie nor Ken, because nothing illegal ever happened at face value. It's a bit hard to explain. I'll also mention that I tried to find Ken online many times after everything ended. I don't know why. Perhaps I felt like I wanted to expose him, or call him out, and wasn't able to find a sliver of information on him. Not by the name Ken, nor by the name on the caller ID. It was as if he never existed. Also, from this incident onwards, I can't stomach a lot of these spiritual organizations. I never liked the idea to begin with, but now I've truly experienced how they can both attract the vulnerable and unsavory who are looking for someone vulnerable to prey on. No judgments to those who are into those sort of things. It just isn't for me personally. I would like to hear what you guys think of this. Do you think my suspicions are plausible? What do you make of Ken and Annie? And to you both, I hope you rot in hell.